Okay, now we're live. Okay. Hi, Sangin, how are you?
Good evening, Akalai. I'm great, thank you. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. So, today we have virtual tours, and we are going to visit Maryland today with Sangin Marshall, who is a country director of American Councils for International Education in Kyrgyzstan, and she will tell us about Maryland. We will wait maybe for like 2 minutes and then we'll start.
Great, thank you for the
Mm-hmm.
introduction.
Yep. Were you born and raised in Maryland and did you study there?
So, I was not born in Maryland. I was born overseas in Germany, actually. And we moved to Maryland when I was about 1.5 years old. So, my whole memory of my youth and childhood is from Maryland. And I went to university in Washington, D.C., which is just next to Maryland. So I lived in the area for a long time. And my parents, they're still living in Maryland in the house where I grew up. So for me, it's still very much my home state.
Okay, wow, great. I'm excited, can't wait.
It's a
We
small
have,
state, and but not too many people have heard of it, especially overseas. But I'm proud of where I'm from, and I've enjoyed growing up there.
great, great, awesome. I think we can start. We have viewers joined us. Cool.
Great.
Okay, I edit your presentation.
Thank you, Akalai,
The
and
stream.
good evening, everybody. So just to reintroduce myself, my name is Sung In Marshall. I'm the country director for American Councils for International Education here in Kyrgyzstan. I have been living in Kyrgyzstan for about 3.5 years, working with different youth and education and cultural programs, including the Flex program, which you may have heard of. And today I'm going to share a little bit with you about my home state of Maryland. So here on the slide, you can see half of the Maryland flag. The whole flag actually is just this same side duplicated in reverse. So the red side is on the top corner and the black and yellow on the bottom. And the flag actually has a lot of Maryland's history in it. So the two designs that you see here originate from the British coat of arms of the original colonists who came to Maryland in the late 1600s. And then during the Civil War, each of these sides of the flag represented the Union and the Confederacy because the state of Maryland was a border state. So within one state flag, there's a lot of history already, and it hopefully gives you a little bit of a sense of the origins of Maryland. So this is the map of Maryland. It's surrounded by several states, including Pennsylvania here on the top, New Jersey, Delaware, Virginia, and West Virginia, and also the District of Columbia, which is, of course, the capital of the United States. I'm from a town called Silver Spring, which you can see this arrow pointing to. Silver Spring is basically a suburb of Washington, D.C. So, for example, from my family's home in Silver Spring to drive into Washington, D.C. takes about 30 minutes. And in my county, Montgomery County, many people who live there work and have jobs in Washington, D.C. It's actually closer for me to drive to Washington than it is to drive to the state capital of Annapolis. Maryland is an unusual shape, and as a result of the shape, there are many different climates and geographies, but I'll talk a little bit about that later on in my presentation. Some basic facts about the state. So the capital is Annapolis. Annapolis is a beautiful small town. It's situated on the Chesapeake Bay, so it's surrounded by water. And it's often called the sailing capital of the United States. Sailing on boats and river boats is very popular. And also, Annapolis is home of the U.S. Naval Academy. So that is the capital of the state. The population is about 6 million. So the population is pretty similar to the size of Kyrgyzstan. But the area is only 32,000 roughly square kilometers. that's about half the size of Kyrgyzstan. So if you can imagine the same population of Kyrgyzstan, but in half the geographic size, that gives you an idea of the population density of Maryland. So it's quite populous, but it doesn't feel crowded, and even our biggest city, Baltimore, doesn't feel like a huge city like New York, for example. It is the 42nd largest state, and as we have 50 states, that's pretty low down on the list. As a result, it is the 9th smallest state. So it's not a very big state. And I've been living overseas for about 10 years in different countries. And every time I live abroad, many people have not heard of Maryland. That's kind of how small it is. I usually tell people I'm from Washington, D.C. because I live so close to it. But Maryland was one of the original 13 colonies, and it was the 7th state to join the Union in 1788. Although it has many sizable towns, its largest city is Baltimore. The state flower of Maryland is the black-eyed Susan, which you can see here. It almost looks like a sunflower, but the size is much, much smaller. And it was selected as the state flower in 1918. So every state has a state flower, and this one grows particularly well in the different climates and geographies of Maryland. So it was selected as the state flower. We also have a state bird, which is called the Baltimore Oriole. And this is a picture of the male Baltimore Oriole. So he's quite colorful. He's got orange and black colorings. The female Oriole has a different color and is more muted. But the Baltimore Oriole and these colors are so popular in Maryland that it is the name of our baseball team, the Baltimore Orioles. As you know, baseball is one of the most popular national sports in the United States, and each state has one or more teams. Maryland's team is the Baltimore Orioles. The state reptile is the diamondback terrapin. And just like with the Baltimore Orioles sports team, the terrapin is the mascot for the University of Maryland at College Park. So I did not go to the University of Maryland, but many of my friends from high school did. And you can see here the diamondback terrapin mascot of the university. His name is Testudo. And on the Maryland University campus, there is a bronze or brass statue of him in front of the library, and students would rub his nose for good luck. So if you visit the university campus, you'll see the statue of Testudo, and his nose is very shiny because everyone has been rubbing him for good luck before his exams. As I mentioned earlier when I showed you the map, Maryland is diverse in terms of geography, and this is because of the way it's shaped. It's quite an unusual shape for a state, and it's often referred to as America in miniature. Because within the state, there are many different types of geography and terrain. So within a small state, to drive from one side of the state to another may only take 4 or 5 hours, but you'll pass through many different kinds of environments and geographic types. So the main 3 geographic regions are the Atlantic Coastal Plain, the Piedmont Plateau, and the Appalachian Mountains. So in the eastern part of the country is the Atlantic Coastal Plain. This includes the Chesapeake Bay, which you can see here in the picture, and the eastern shore. The central part of the state, just before the fall line, is the Piedmont Plateau. And this part of the state is characterized by rolling hills, fields. There are quite a lot of farms and rural areas. And in the western part of the state, which is called the Panhandle, you have access to the Appalachian Mountains. And the Appalachian Mountain Trail, or the Appalachian Mountain Chain, is a chain of mountains that runs all the way down the eastern coast from Georgia all the way up to Maine. And part of the chain of mountains is in Maryland. So within one state, you have ocean and the bay, you have kind of fields and meadows and the mountains. So it's a small state, but there's actually a lot of different places to visit. And if you enjoy the outdoors, there's many activities that you can engage in, from hiking, but at the Chesapeake Bay, there's kayaking and water sports. And so there's a lot of opportunities to spend time outdoors. And a lot of people who live in Maryland choose to take their vacations in Maryland because there's so much to do. So you don't have to travel very far to have a bit of fun in Maryland. In the south of Maryland is an island called Chincoteague. And this island is a thin and long island. Half of it is in the state of Maryland, and the other half is in the state of Virginia, which is our neighbor to the south. And what makes this part of the state unique or interesting is that on this island, there live a colony of wild ponies, which you can see here. And every year, a big event in the state is to watch the ponies swim from Chincoteague Island to another island to the south called Chincoteague Island. And it's a big event to watch these wild horses swim and migrate for the summer. This is one of my favorite places in the state because it's really beautiful and peaceful. It's next to the water. There are beaches where you can camp and spend time outside. And it's really nice to see these wild horses living in nature. I think maybe it's pretty similar to Kyrgyzstan in that sense. If you go outside of Bishkek, you can see horses grazing in the mountains and enjoy nature. So there are some similarities between Maryland and Kyrgyzstan, I think. Another very popular place, which you can see in the photo here, is Ocean City, Maryland. So again, within one state, we have mountains, but we also have the seaside. And this is a very popular place for families to go vacationing. And usually high school students across Maryland, once they graduate from high school, they come to Ocean City and celebrate their graduation during Beach Week. So that's a very crowded and popular and busy time to spend at Ocean City. Ocean City is kind of a long, thin stretch of beachfront on the Atlantic Ocean. And if you can see in the picture here where these buildings are, just below these hotels, there's a classic boardwalk. So this is essentially a pathway made of wooden deck, and you can visit different shops and restaurants and arcades along the boardwalk. It's pretty accessible. It's not very expensive to spend a vacation here. It's very close for many people who live in Maryland. For example, from where I live, or my parents currently live, to Ocean City, it takes about 2.5 hours to drive. So it's pretty close by and is a very popular option for vacations. Coming on to foods. So growing up from a very small age, I think my earliest memory might have been 5 years old, summertime meant crabs. So Maryland is on the Chesapeake Bay, and one of the most commonly found seafood items is the Maryland blue crab. So here you can see in the picture they're already cooked, so they've turned red. But when they're living in the water, they're actually blue, and hence the name. The crabs are steamed and served with Old Bay seasoning, which is a must-have for anybody from Maryland. This seasoning is spicy, it's salty, and it's good not just on crabs, but on corn, potatoes, salads, anything you want to put it on. Marylanders will put Old Bay on it. So it's one of our favorite seasonings, and it's become so popular now you can buy kind of t-shirts and hats with Old Bay seasoning logos on it. It's really an icon for us in Maryland because I think it represents, the flavor of summer to us. So eating crabs is very communal. You gather your friends or your families, you put down brown paper on a table. The crabs are steamed, usually with corn and potatoes, sprinkled with Old Bay, and then dumped onto this table where you sit around and you pick up the crabs and you start cracking the shells and sharing and enjoying them with your friends and family. So for me, crabs and having crabs in the summer, this is the number one thing I think I miss now that I don't live in Maryland, because it really signifies summer to me. It signifies spending time with friends and family, and it really kind of boils down what it means to be from Maryland. Another very popular food item is related to this one. It's crab cakes. So of course, Maryland produces a lot of crabs. And so in addition to eating them steamed whole, it's also possible to take the meat out and make crab cakes. They're kind of like little burgers, right? Made out of crab. So this is another very popular food item. I will say that with climate change and the ecology of the Chesapeake Bay changing, sometimes the number of crabs that are available in any season has decreased. There's a lot of efforts right now to restore the Chesapeake Bay, to reduce pollution, and to try to reverse some of these effects of climate change so that we can have crabs in future summers. So from when I was a child, crabs have gotten much more expensive as a result because there's simply not enough to go around. One food that I learned about when preparing this presentation is the Smith Island cake. I'm from Maryland and I had never heard of this cake before, and I have never had it before, but I've been to Smith Island. So Smith Island is in the middle of the Chesapeake Bay, so between the main part of Maryland and the eastern shore. And apparently this island is well known for its cake. The cake looks a little bit like the medevik, which we have here, but the inside cream is made with chocolate. So it's like between 8 and 12 layers of biscuit cake with chocolate in between. It sounds very good, and I hope that next time I go back to Maryland, I'll have an opportunity to try it, because I didn't know it was such a famous food from my home state. The state team sport is lacrosse, and this is the University of Maryland team playing, the men's team playing lacrosse. So lacrosse is a sport that originally originated from the indigenous Iroquois nation. So the Iroquois nation is a Native American nation based originally in New York. And their warriors would play this game of lacrosse, which involves catching a small ball in these kind of nets with long sticks. The sport is played now by men and women, but the rules for the sports for men and women are a little bit different. So with men's lacrosse, here you can see they're wearing helmets and pads. Some players have long sticks, they are defenders, and other players have short sticks, they are attackers. And the game is quite rough for the men's team sport. They're allowed to check or hit each other with their sticks, and it can be quite rough. For women's lacrosse, they don't wear helmets. Their lacrosse sticks are all the same length, and there are more rules around physical contact and pushing. So the women's rules are a little bit different. I did not play lacrosse, but it was very popular, and I was the lacrosse team manager at my high school. So I helped keep track of equipments and scores and things like that. The state sport is actually jousting. Jousting, if you've watched any old movies set in medieval English times, you'll have seen two knights riding on their horses with long sticks, and that is jousting. Jousting was the official sport of Maryland, and it came from England when the settlers originally colonized the state of Maryland. Some very enthusiastic individuals are still keeping jousting alive today, but they play a very different version than what you might have seen in films with two knights riding at each other with these very sharp, pointy sticks. So in the modern version of jousting, it's still on horseback and you're still carrying a long, pointy stick, but the aim is to ride towards a stand that has 3 rings, and the object is to get the rings onto the stick. So I also learned something new today. I didn't know that jousting was considered the state sport of Maryland. So this was also news to me. So in essence, that kind of sums up the basic facts and interesting information that I wanted to share with you. I hope it was not boring. There is a place in Maryland, just outside of Baltimore, called Boring, Maryland. But I hope that the information and facts and background that I shared with you was interesting. And I would be happy to answer any questions that you have about my home state. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sangin, very much for the presentation. I myself learned a lot about Maryland.
Me too.
About jousting and the island with wild ponies. Wow! Cool. If our viewers have any questions about Maryland, please write in the comment section your questions and we will read them and answer them. Feel free. Okay, I have some questions. What would be like the top 3 places that you would like to recommend for visitors? Top 3 in Maryland.
Okay, so I would definitely say Ocean City because it's a nice beach vacation and everybody likes to swim and spend time at the beach, I think. It's kind of the Maryland equivalent of going to Issaquah Lake, like in Kyrgyzstan. I would also recommend hiking at Sugarloaf Mountain. So it's not a very big mountain and it's not a very difficult hike. This is in a town called Dickinson, Maryland. So it's not so far from Washington, D.C., maybe 1.5 hours driving. And it's a nice mountain and it's called Sugarloaf because in the, I guess, 17th and 18th centuries, they used to sell sugar not loose and not in cubes, but in a loaf shape. And so the mountain looks like this loaf of sugar, and it's got the name Sugarloaf Mountain. So I would also recommend that as my second place. And thirdly, I personally enjoy visiting Annapolis. It's the capital of the state, but besides that, it's very beautiful because it's next to the water. You can rent or hire a boat and spend time in the And for example, when I go to visit Annapolis with my family, we like to go to this one crab restaurant. It's on the river. It's called Cantler's Riverside. And we spend the afternoon there eating crabs and having a nice summer day out. And then later we walk around Annapolis, which has quite a lot of old buildings dating back to the 1800s and 1700s. So the style of the city is quite different than maybe what people think of when they think of America. The style is maybe a little bit closer to English colonial styles. And so it's a nice place to visit. It has a lot of history. And it's next to the water too.
Okay, wow. Okay, thank you. So it was Ocean City, hiking in Sugarloaf Mountains, and then the capital, Annapolis.
Yes.
Great. Okay. There is one more question. It says, I'm excited for this next one. I would like to know Sangin's favorite foods or restaurants in Maryland.
I am super excited about Maryland crabs. You know, like I mentioned, crabs are an essential Maryland food. It is not summer in Maryland without crabs and Old Bay seasoning. So for me, like, this is 100% my favorite Maryland food. In terms of restaurants, you know, Maryland has a very diverse population. So there are many different restaurants reflecting different immigrant communities and nationalities. So you can get any type of food that you want, you know, ranging from Ethiopian food to Taiwanese food, Korean food, and even German. So there's many different foods to try. So for me, it's difficult to pick just one restaurant or one place to go. But that's also a nice opportunity to explore and get to know different people and cultures, even within a pretty small state.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is, it says, thank you, Sangin. Nice presentation and food. Wow, crabs and oysters, nutritious. What is your favorite food place in Bishkek, which is similar to food in Maryland?
Similar to food in Maryland. I can tell you what my favorite Kyrgyz food is. I love lagman and I love plov, but it's very different than the food that you get in Maryland. Although I will say that actually in Maryland, near the town of Baltimore, which is the biggest city in Maryland, there's actually an Uzbek community, and they opened an Uzbek restaurant. So even when I'm in Maryland, I can go and eat shashlik and samsa and lagman and plov. So
Sounds nice.
that's like maybe not directly answering the question, but if it exists in Maryland, lagman and plov, I think I can answer it that way.
Cool, thank you. There's one more question. It said, thank you for your interesting presentation. How are you spending your time in Maryland now?
I am not in Maryland. I am in Bishkek. So I am spending my time waiting out the quarantine and coronavirus here in Bishkek. But if I was in Maryland, I would probably be spending time at home with my parents, whom I don't get to see so often.
Okay. People are also saying that they will definitely try crab cakes if they go to
They're
Maryland.
delicious.
Must try. I also have one more question. What would be the 3 words that you would use to describe Maryland, but like your Maryland, subjectively from your experience?
Okay. I would say the first word is diverse, because it's diverse in its geography with, ocean and mountains in one state. It's also diverse in its people. So it's a very diverse state with different immigrant populations and communities and people of all different backgrounds and ethnicities and races. So diverse is number 1. Number 2, I would probably say friendly. It is a small state and it's quite densely populated, but everybody that I meet and that I know from Maryland, we're enthusiastic about meeting other people, about spending time with each other. So friendly. And third, I would say, can I call it? I would say home, because it is home to me. I've lived in many different places over the last years, and I would call it home. And the reason for that is that my family is still there, and growing up in Maryland provided, I think, a really well-rounded upbringing. My high school was very diverse. There were lots of opportunities, and so yeah, for me, no matter where I live, it will always be home.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is, what are other similarities between Maryland and Kyrgyzstan? And the next question is, what are ethnic minorities in Maryland? So the similarities and ethnic minorities.
I would say similarities with Kyrgyzstan. Well, as I mentioned in the presentation, we also have wild horses that you can see. So having horses around you in the wild is something that occurs not just in Kyrgyzstan, but in Maryland. I would also say that maybe the people are quite similar. As you know, in Kyrgyzstan, people are very hospitable and friendly and welcoming. And I think that is the similar kind of attitude in Maryland as well. There are many small towns in Maryland and places where people kind of know each other well, like everybody knows everybody, that kind of town. So I think that's another similarity. Yeah, and then I would say, there are a lot of differences no matter where you look, but at the same time, I think there are interesting places to discover anywhere. So in Maryland, there's lots of different places to discover, something new to learn always. And I think that's similar to Kyrgyzstan too. There's a lot of places to discover, a lot of places to visit, new places to see. So I think that's another similarity. There's always an opportunity to go somewhere different and experience something new. And then can you repeat the second question, please?
What are ethnic minorities in Maryland?
Okay, so there are a lot of different immigrant communities in Maryland. This is partly because it's so close to Washington, D.C., and people tend to move to that area for jobs. But in Maryland, there are all kinds of communities ranging from Chinese, Taiwanese, Korean, Vietnamese, to Ethiopian communities, to there is a large El Salvadoran population in Maryland, immigrants from other Central American countries like Honduras and Guatemala as well. There are also, if you look at the history of immigration, Germanic populations, and so it's very diverse, and there's many different nationalities. And I think that's the case for many states in the United States.
Okay, thank you. That was our last question. Thank you so much for the presentation. It was awesome. So much to learn, so many things, so many new things. And thank you for our viewers for asking questions, commenting. Thank you very much. So,
Thank you, everybody, for listening, and I was glad to share more information about my state with all of you.
yeah. Okay, so stay tuned for our next virtual tour, which is happening on July 3rd. So, yeah, I think it's time to say goodbye. See you.